The annual military gala at Fort Braxton was in full swing when Colonel James Mitchell walked through the grand ballroom doors. The chandeliers cast golden light across hundreds of uniformed officers, their medals gleaming as they mingled with champagne glasses in hand. Laughter echoed through the vast space, mixing with the soft jazz music from the live band in the corner. Mitchell had been looking forward to this evening for weeks. After 18 months deployed in Afghanistan, he was finally able to celebrate with his fellow officers. The Distinguished Service Medal on his chest felt heavy with pride as he scanned the room for familiar faces. "Jim. There you are." Captain Rodriguez appeared at his elbow, grinning widely. "We've been waiting for you. Come on, there's someone you need to meet." Rodriguez guided him through the crowd toward a corner where a small group of officers had gathered. Mitchell recognized most of them: Lieutenant Colonel Barnes, Major Peterson, Captain Williams. They were all talking animatedly, their voices slightly elevated from the evening's drinks. "Gentlemen," Rodriguez announced as they approached, "look who finally decided to show up." The group turned, and Mitchell was greeted with hearty handshakes and back slaps. These were men he'd served with for years, brothers forged in the crucible of military service. Barnes had been his roommate at West Point. Peterson had saved his life during a firefight in Kandahar. Williams had been his best man at his wedding. "Mitchell, you old dog," Barnes laughed, raising his glass. "How does it feel to be back in civilization?" "Like I'm dreaming," Mitchell replied honestly. "I keep expecting to wake up in a tent with mortars going off outside." The conversation flowed easily. They talked about deployments, about friends who had fallen, about the changes happening in the military. The alcohol loosened tongues and brought back memories both bitter and sweet. As the evening progressed, Mitchell noticed a young woman in uniform standing near the bar. She couldn't have been more than 25, with dark hair pulled back in a perfect military bun. Her uniform was crisp, her posture impeccable, but something about her seemed different from the other junior officers scattered throughout the room. "Who's the new kid?" Mitchell asked, nodding in her direction. Peterson followed his gaze and shrugged. "Haven't seen her before. Probably some lieutenant fresh out of the academy. You know how it is, they send them to these things to network." Williams laughed. "Remember when we were that young? Scared to death at our first formal event, trying not to embarrass ourselves in front of the brass?" "Speak for yourself," Barnes interjected. "I was born for this kind of thing." The group chuckled, but Mitchell found his attention drifting back to the young woman. There was something about the way she carried herself, the way other officers seemed to give her space when she moved through the crowd. It wasn't the nervous energy of a new lieutenant, it was something else entirely. The evening wore on, and the officers' conversation grew more relaxed, more informal. They shared war stories, complained about bureaucracy, and speculated about promotions. The alcohol continued to flow, and inhibitions began to lower. "You know what really gets me?" Peterson said, his voice slightly slurred. "All these diversity initiatives. Don't get me wrong, I support equality, but sometimes I feel like merit doesn't matter anymore." Williams nodded emphatically. "Exactly. Some of these new officers, especially the women, they get fast-tracked because of politics, not because they've earned it." Mitchell felt uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking, but before he could redirect it, Barnes jumped in. "I heard there's some girl here tonight who's supposedly some kind of hotshot," Barnes said, gesturing vaguely toward the crowd. "Probably got her rank through quotas rather than combat experience." "That's probably her," Peterson said, pointing toward the young woman Mitchell had noticed earlier. "Look at her, barely old enough to buy a drink, wearing a uniform like she's earned the right to be here." The comments continued, growing more pointed and more inappropriate with each drink. Mitchell tried to change the subject several times, but his fellow officers seemed determined to voice their frustrations about what they perceived as unfair advantages given to women in the military. "I bet she's never seen real combat," Williams said with a bitter laugh. "Probably spent her whole career behind a desk somewhere safe. Or in some cushy assignment in Europe," Rodriguez added. "While we were getting shot at in the sandbox." Mitchell watched as the young woman moved through the room with quiet confidence. She stopped to speak with various groups, always professional, always composed. Something about her demeanor reminded him of the most seasoned officers he knew, the ones who had been tested under fire and emerged stronger. "Maybe we should reserve judgment," Mitchell suggested quietly. "We don't know anything about her service record." "Come on, Jim," Barnes said with a dismissive wave. "Look at her. What could she possibly know about real military leadership?" The conversation might have continued in this vein, but, suddenly, the room's atmosphere began to shift. Mitchell noticed at first conversations around them were growing quieter, more subdued. Officers were straightening their posture, adjusting their uniforms. "What's happening?" Williams asked, looking around with confusion. Then, Mitchell saw him, General Thompson, the base commander, making his way through the crowd. The general was a legend, a man who had commanded respect throughout his 30-year career. His mere presence could silence a room, and tonight was no exception. But something was different about the general's approach tonight. He wasn't making his usual rounds, shaking hands and making small talk. Instead, he seemed focused on a specific destination, moving with purpose through the crowd. Mitchell and his companions watched as General Thompson approached the young woman they had been discussing. The general's face was serious, almost solemn, as he reached her side. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath as the general stopped in front of the young officer. Then, to everyone's astonishment, General Thompson came to attention and rendered a sharp, crisp salute. The woman returned the salute with equal precision, and then, in a voice that carried clearly through the suddenly silent room, General Thompson spoke. "Ma'am, I wanted to personally welcome you to Fort Braxton. It's an honor to have you here tonight." Mitchell felt his stomach drop. The young woman responded with grace and humility, but her words carried an unmistakable authority that belied her apparent youth. Around them, Mitchell could hear the sharp intake of breath from his fellow officers. Barnes had gone pale, his champagne glass frozen halfway to his lips. Peterson was staring with wide eyes, clearly struggling to process what he was witnessing. The general continued speaking with the young woman for several minutes, their conversation conducted in the respectful tones reserved for exchanges between senior officers. Other high-ranking officials began approaching, each offering their own respectful greetings. Rodriguez leaned close to Mitchell's ear. "Did the general just salute her?" he whispered. Mitchell nodded slowly, a sick feeling growing in his stomach. All around them, other officers were beginning to put the pieces together. Conversations died mid-sentence as people realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. The young woman handled the attention with remarkable composure. She spoke with each officer who approached, asking thoughtful questions about their units, their deployments, their families. It was clear she was not just being polite, she was demonstrating the kind of engaged leadership that marked truly exceptional military officers. Williams grabbed Mitchell's arm. "Jim, who is she? What's her rank?" Mitchell shook his head. "I don't know, but we're about to find out." The general finished his conversation and began moving toward the center of the room, the young woman at his side. Other senior officers followed, forming an informal procession that commanded the attention of everyone present. As they passed Mitchell's group, he caught a glimpse of the insignia on the woman's uniform. His blood ran cold as he recognized the stars, not the single star of a brigadier general, not even the 2 stars of a major general, but something that made his knees weak. Barnes saw it too and immediately began choking on his drink. Peterson grabbed Mitchell's shoulder for support, his face ashen. The general called for attention, his voice carrying easily through the now completely silent ballroom. Every officer in the room turned to face him, many coming to attention automatically. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Thompson began, "I want to take a moment to introduce someone very special who has joined us tonight." The silence in the room was absolute. Mitchell could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Beside him, his fellow officers stood frozen, their earlier bravado completely evaporated. "It is my great honor," the general continued, "to introduce Lieutenant General Sarah Chen, recently appointed as the youngest divisional commander in Army history." The words hit Mitchell like a physical blow. Lieutenant General. 3 stars. A rank that meant she outranked not just him and his friends, but nearly every officer in the room, including several he had seen treating her with casual indifference throughout the evening. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Mitchell barely heard it over the rushing sound in his ears. He thought about every word his group had spoken about this woman, every assumption they had made, every dismissive comment about her qualifications and experience. Lieutenant General Chen stepped forward to address the crowd. Her voice was clear, confident, and carried the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to command. "Thank you, General Thompson. I'm honored to be here with all of you tonight. The opportunity to serve alongside such dedicated officers is truly a privilege." Mitchell watched her face as she spoke, noting the intelligence in her eyes, the calm authority in her bearing. This was not someone who had been given her position, this was someone who had earned every star on her collar. As she continued speaking about her vision for leadership and her commitment to the soldiers under her command, Mitchell found himself thinking about his own assumptions, his own biases. How had he so completely misjudged this officer? How had years of military training and experience failed to teach him to recognize true leadership when he saw it? The formal introduction concluded, and the crowd began to disperse slightly, though the energy in the room had completely changed. Officers who had been casual and relaxed now moved with the careful awareness that comes from being in the presence of very senior leadership. Mitchell's group remained frozen in place, each man dealing with his own shock and embarrassment. The weight of their earlier conversation hung over them like a dark cloud. "We need to get out of here," Peterson whispered urgently. "Before anyone realizes what we were saying." But it was too late. Several officers nearby had clearly overheard parts of their earlier discussion, and word was beginning to spread. Mitchell could see the looks of disapproval and disgust on the faces around them. Lieutenant General Chen was now moving through the crowd again, speaking with various groups of officers. Her path seemed random, but Mitchell had a sinking feeling that it was anything but. "Gentlemen," she said, appearing suddenly beside their group with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, "I don't believe we've been introduced." The words hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Mitchell felt his throat go dry as Lieutenant General Chen extended her hand toward their group. Her smile was professional, but there was something in her eyes that suggested she had heard more of their conversation than any of them would have preferred. "Colonel Mitchell," he managed, stepping forward to shake her hand. His voice came out slightly hoarse, and he cleared his throat awkwardly. "Lieutenant Colonel Barnes," Barnes said quickly, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. The other officers introduced themselves in turn, each man struggling to maintain military bearing while internally crumbling. Peterson's hand visibly shook as he saluted. Williams couldn't seem to make eye contact. "It's a pleasure to meet you all," Lieutenant General Chen said, her voice warm but with an undertone that made Mitchell's skin crawl. "I've heard some interesting things about this group tonight." The implication was clear, and Mitchell felt heat rise in his cheeks. Around them, other officers had begun to take notice of the interaction. Some moved closer, perhaps hoping to witness what promised to be an uncomfortable conversation. "Ma'am," Mitchell began, desperate to salvage the situation, "we were just discussing—" "Oh, I know exactly what you were discussing, Colonel," she interrupted gently. "Sound carries quite well in a room like this, especially when the conversation becomes passionate." Barnes made a small choking sound. Rodriguez looked like he might be sick. Lieutenant General Chen clasped her hands behind her back, a gesture that somehow made her appear even more formidable despite her relatively small stature. "Tell me, gentlemen, what do you think qualifies someone for senior military leadership?" The question was clearly a trap, but Mitchell knew they had no choice but to answer. "Combat experience, ma'am. Proven leadership under pressure. The ability to make difficult decisions and live with the consequences." "An interesting perspective," she replied thoughtfully. "And you believe these qualifications are somehow gender-specific?" The silence stretched uncomfortably. Peterson shifted nervously from foot to foot. Williams studied his shoes with intense concentration. "No ma'am," Mitchell said quietly. "That's not what we meant." "Isn't it?" Her voice remained level, professional, but there was steel underneath. Because from what I overheard, it seemed like you had some very specific opinions about women in the military, particularly regarding how we might achieve our positions. Mitchell wanted to disappear. Every word they had spoken earlier now seemed to echo in his mind with crystal clarity. The casual dismissal, the assumptions about quotas and politics, the sneering references to diversity initiatives. Perhaps, Lieutenant General Chen continued, you'd like to know a little bit about my background before you finalize your assessment of my qualifications. None of them responded. What could they possibly say? I graduated from West Point summa cum laude, she began, her voice taking on the matter-of-fact tone of someone reciting a resume. I was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the infantry, which I believe was your branch as well, Colonel Mitchell. Mitchell nodded miserably. I spent my first deployment in Iraq, leading a platoon through some of the heaviest fighting in Fallujah. My second deployment was in Afghanistan, where I commanded a company conducting night raids against high-value targets. Peterson's face had gone completely white. Williams was now staring at her with something approaching horror. During my third deployment, also in Afghanistan, I was wounded by an IED while leading my battalion in a major offensive operation. I spent 4 months recovering, then returned to combat duty against medical advice because my soldiers needed their commander. She paused, letting the words sink in. I've been awarded the Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars with V device, the Purple Heart, and the Combat Action Badge. I've commanded at every level from platoon to division, and I've served in combat for a total of 38 months across 5 deployments. The list continued, each accomplishment hitting Mitchell like a physical blow. This woman had not only seen more combat than any of them, she had excelled in it. She had led soldiers in battle while they were still learning how to shine their boots properly. I mention this not to boast, she said, but because I want you to understand something very clearly. I didn't receive my position because of diversity quotas or political correctness. I earned every rank, every medal, and every command through blood, sweat, and the kind of sacrifice that apparently you gentlemen believe women are incapable of making. Mitchell felt shame wash over him in waves. This was worse than any dressing down he had ever received from a superior officer. This was a complete dismantling of his assumptions, his prejudices, and his character. Now, Lieutenant General Chen continued, I could make this a formal matter. I could have you brought up on charges for conduct unbecoming an officer. The things you said tonight were not just inappropriate, they were a violation of Army values and regulations regarding equal opportunity and respect for fellow service members. Barnes looked like he might faint. Rodriguez was gripping his champagne glass so tightly Mitchell thought it might shatter. However, she said, and Mitchell detected the slightest softening in her tone, I believe in second chances. I believe that good officers can learn from their mistakes and become better leaders. She stepped closer to their group, lowering her voice so that only they could hear. But, understand this, I will be watching all of you very carefully. Your careers, your reputations, and your futures in this army now depend entirely on how you choose to proceed from this moment forward. The threat was clear, and Mitchell knew she had every right to make it. They had disrespected not just her, but every woman who had ever served with honor and distinction. Furthermore, she continued, I expect each of you to think very carefully about the soldiers under your command. If you hold these kinds of attitudes about women in leadership positions, how are you treating the female soldiers who serve under you? How are you evaluating their performance? How are you affecting their careers? The questions hit home with devastating accuracy. Mitchell thought about the women in his unit, the assumptions he might have made, the opportunities he might not have offered, the recommendations he might not have written. Ma'am, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, we were wrong. Completely, inexcusably wrong. Yes, you were, she agreed simply. The question now is what you're going to do about it. Lieutenant General Chen straightened to her full height, and, despite being several inches shorter than most of them, she somehow seemed to tower over the entire group. I want written apologies from each of you, she said. Not to me, I don't need your apologies. I want them submitted to the Equal Opportunity Office, detailing what you said tonight and acknowledging how those attitudes might have affected your leadership and your treatment of subordinates. Peterson made a small sound of protest, but she held up a hand to silence him. Additionally, you will each complete sensitivity training, and you will each mentor a female officer for the next year. You will help them with their careers, their development, and their advancement. You will learn firsthand what challenges they face and what obstacles they overcome. Mitchell nodded slowly. It was more than fair, it was merciful. Finally, she said, you will remember this conversation every single day for the rest of your military careers. Every time you interact with a female soldier, every time you make an evaluation or recommendation, every time you hear another officer making the kinds of comments you made tonight. She paused, looking at each man in turn. The army is changing, gentlemen. The world is changing. You can either change with it and become better officers and better men, or you can cling to your outdated attitudes and watch your careers end in disgrace. With that, she turned and began to walk away, then stopped and looked back over her shoulder. Oh, and Colonel Mitchell? I knew your father. General Robert Mitchell was my mentor when I was a young captain. He was one of the finest officers I ever served under, and one of the strongest advocates for women in combat roles I've ever known. I suspect he would be very disappointed by the conversation I witnessed tonight. Mitchell felt the blood drain from his face. His father had never mentioned knowing a Lieutenant General Chen, but then, again, his father had mentored hundreds of officers over the course of his career. The thought that this woman had learned leadership from his own father, a man he had idolized his entire life, made his shame burn even deeper. As Lieutenant General Chen walked away, the group stood in stunned silence. Around them, the party continued, but Mitchell noticed that several officers were watching them with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. Word of their encounter was clearly spreading. We're finished, Peterson whispered. Our careers are over. No, Mitchell said quietly, watching Lieutenant General Chen as she rejoined a group of senior officers across the room. Our careers as we knew them are over. But maybe that's not such a bad thing. Barnes looked at him incredulously. How can you say that? She just threatened to destroy us. She didn't threaten to destroy us, Mitchell corrected. She gave us a chance to rebuild ourselves into something better. He thought about the stories his father had told him about leadership, about honor, about treating all soldiers with respect regardless of their background. Somehow, over the years, Mitchell had lost sight of those lessons. Tonight had been a brutal reminder of what he should have known all along. What do we do now? Rodriguez asked quietly. Mitchell straightened his shoulders and looked at each of his friends in turn. We do exactly what she told us to do. We write those apologies. We complete the training. We mentor female officers not because we have to, but because it's the right thing to do. And if our careers suffer? Williams asked. Then, we deal with the consequences, Mitchell replied. But maybe, just maybe, if we handle this right, we can salvage not just our careers but our integrity. As the evening wound down and officers began to leave, Mitchell found himself thinking about Lieutenant General Chen's words. She was right, the army was changing, and officers like her were leading that change. He could either be part of the solution or part of the problem. He watched as she prepared to leave, surrounded by a respectful group of senior officers. Despite everything that had happened, or perhaps because of it, he found himself approaching her one final time. Ma'am, he said, coming to attention and rendering a proper salute. I wanted to thank you. She returned the salute and looked at him with curiosity. Thank me? For what? For the lesson, he said simply. And for giving us a chance to be better. Lieutenant General Chen studied his face for a moment, perhaps looking for signs of sincerity. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her. Don't thank me yet, Colonel, she said. Thank me in a year, when you've done the work and proven that you've actually learned something from tonight. As she walked away, Mitchell knew that this evening would mark a turning point in his life and career. The question now was whether he would have the courage and character to make the most of the opportunity she had given him. 6 months had passed since that night at Fort Braxton, and Colonel James Mitchell sat in his office reviewing the quarterly performance evaluations for his battalion. The stack of papers seemed larger than usual, but he approached each evaluation with a thoroughness that would have surprised his former self. Captain Sarah Rodriguez knocked on his doorframe. "Sir, you wanted to see me?" Mitchell looked up and smiled. Captain Rodriguez had been assigned as his mentee through Lieutenant General Chen's directive, and, over the past months, she had become one of the most impressive officers he had ever worked with. "Come in, Sarah. Have a seat." She settled into the chair across from his desk, her bearing confident but respectful. Mitchell remembered his first meeting with her, how uncomfortable he had felt, how uncertain he had been about the whole arrangement. Now, he genuinely looked forward to their weekly mentoring sessions. "I've been reviewing your application for the Advanced Infantry Officer course," he said, holding up a thick folder. "Your qualifications are outstanding." "Thank you, sir. I appreciate all the guidance you've given me on the application." Mitchell nodded, but his mind drifted back to those early meetings. Captain Rodriguez had been polite but wary, clearly aware that his mentorship was not entirely voluntary. She had answered his questions with military precision but had been reluctant to share her real concerns or challenges. It had taken weeks for her to trust him enough to be honest. When she finally opened up, her stories had shaken him to his core. She had been passed over for combat assignments because commanders worried about unit cohesion. She had endured inappropriate comments from fellow officers who questioned her physical capabilities. She had watched less qualified male officers receive opportunities that were denied to her without explanation. "There's something I want to discuss with you," Mitchell continued. "I've been thinking about your career progression, and I believe you're ready for company command." Captain Rodriguez's eyes widened slightly. "Sir, I wasn't expecting to be considered for command for another year at least." "That's exactly the problem," Mitchell said, leaning back in his chair. "You're more than qualified now, but the system has taught you to expect delays and obstacles that your male counterparts don't face." He pulled out another folder. "I've written a recommendation for you to take command of Alpha Company. They need a strong leader, and you're the best candidate we have." For the first time since he had known her, Captain Rodriguez looked genuinely emotional. "Sir, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll take the job and make me proud," Mitchell replied with a smile. After she left his office, Mitchell returned to the evaluations on his desk. Each one received his careful attention, but he paid particular notice to the female soldiers in his unit. He looked for signs of bias in his own assessments, questioned his assumptions, and made sure he was evaluating performance based on merit alone. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. "Colonel Mitchell? This is Major Stevens from Division. Lieutenant General Chen would like to see you in her office at 1500 hours." Mitchell's stomach tightened. Over the past 6 months, he had heard about Lieutenant General Chen regularly. Her leadership of the division had been exemplary, earning praise from subordinates and superiors alike. She had implemented new training protocols that had improved readiness across all units. She had also continued her campaign to ensure equal opportunity for all soldiers, regardless of gender. But this would be their first direct interaction since that night at the gala. At precisely 1500 hours, Mitchell stood outside Lieutenant General Chen's office. Her aide, a young lieutenant, gestured for him to enter. "Colonel Mitchell reporting as requested, ma'am," he said, coming to attention and saluting. "At ease, Colonel. Please, have a seat." Lieutenant General Chen's office was spartanly decorated but professional. Her awards and decorations were displayed on one wall, and Mitchell noticed several photographs of her with troops in various combat zones. Behind her desk hung a simple framed quote, "Leadership is not about being in charge. It's about taking care of those in your charge." "I've been reviewing the reports from your battalion," she began without preamble. "Your unit's performance has improved significantly over the past 6 months." "Thank you, ma'am. We've been working hard on several initiatives. I'm particularly interested in your mentoring program," she continued. "Captain Rodriguez speaks very highly of your guidance." Mitchell felt a flush of pride, but also nervousness. "She's an exceptional officer, ma'am. Any success she achieves is her own doing." "Perhaps," Lieutenant General Chen said, studying him carefully. But good mentorship can make all the difference in an officer's development. Tell me, what have you learned from the experience? The question caught him off guard. He had expected to discuss Rodriguez's progress, not his own learning. I've learned that I had a lot of blind spots, ma'am, he said honestly. Things I never noticed or considered because they didn't affect me directly. Captain Rodriguez has opened my eyes to challenges that many of our female soldiers face routinely. Such as? Mitchell thought carefully before responding. The assumption that physical differences translate to leadership deficiencies. The tendency to exclude women from informal networks where real decisions get made. The way we sometimes assign women to support roles without considering their qualifications for combat positions. Lieutenant General Chan nodded thoughtfully. And how has this awareness changed your leadership approach? I'm more intentional about inclusion now, Mitchell replied. I make sure female officers are included in all relevant meetings and decisions. I examine my own biases when making assignments or recommendations. I listen more carefully when soldiers raise concerns about discrimination or harassment. Good, she said simply. And the other officers from that night? How are they progressing? Mitchell hesitated. He knew that Barnes and Peterson were struggling with the changes they had been required to make. Their mentoring relationships were rocky, and their attitudes seemed largely unchanged. Williams had taken a different approach, throwing himself into the sensitivity training and genuinely working to understand different perspectives. Rodriguez had been transferred to another base, making his progress harder to track. It's been a mixed bag, ma'am, Mitchell said diplomatically. Some have embraced the opportunity for growth more readily than others. I see. Lieutenant General Chan made a note on a pad. And what about you, Colonel? Have you embraced this opportunity? Mitchell met her gaze directly. I believe so, ma'am, but I think that's for others to judge. What I can say is that I'm a better officer and a better leader than I was 6 months ago. Why? Because I understand now that my job is to bring out the best in all my soldiers, not just the ones who look like me or come from similar backgrounds. I understand that diversity of thought and experience makes units stronger, not weaker. Lieutenant General Chan leaned back in her chair. I want to share something with you, Colonel. Do you know why I decided to handle that situation at the gala the way I did? Mitchell shook his head. I could have had all of you brought up on charges immediately. Your conduct was clearly inappropriate, and there would have been ample justification for formal disciplinary action. Mitchell waited, unsure where this was leading. But I've learned something over the years about changing attitudes and behaviors. Punishment might modify behavior in the short term, but it rarely changes hearts and minds. Education and mentorship, on the other hand, can create lasting transformation. She stood and walked to the window overlooking the base parade ground. Your father once told me something that stuck with me, she continued. He said that the mark of a true leader is not the absence of mistakes, but the willingness to learn from them and become better. Mitchell felt a familiar pang at the mention of his father, who had passed away 2 years earlier. General Mitchell saw something in me when I was a young captain, she continued. He took a chance on me when others wouldn't. He mentored me, challenged me, and helped me become the officer I am today. In many ways, what I did for you that night was what he would have done. She turned back to face him. Which brings me to why you're here. I have an opportunity I'd like to discuss with you. Mitchell straightened in his chair. I'm recommending you for promotion to Brigadier General. The words hit Mitchell like a thunderbolt. He had hoped for promotion eventually, but this was far sooner than he had expected. Ma'am, I'm honored, but I'm not sure I understand. You've demonstrated exactly the kind of growth and leadership evolution that the Army needs, she explained. More importantly, you've shown that you can change, learn, and become a better version of yourself. That's exactly the kind of officer we need in senior leadership positions. Mitchell felt overwhelmed. 6 months ago, he had thought his career might be over. Now, he was being offered the opportunity of a lifetime. There's one condition, Lieutenant General Chen continued. If you accept this promotion, you'll be assigned to work directly with me on a new initiative. We're developing Army-wide programs to improve leadership development and equal opportunity. I need officers who understand both the challenges and the solutions. Ma'am, I would be honored to accept. Don't answer yet, she said, holding up a hand. Think about what this means. You'll be taking on one of the most challenging assignments in the Army. You'll face resistance from officers who don't want to change. You'll have to confront difficult truths about institutional bias and systemic discrimination. Are you prepared for that? Mitchell thought about Captain Rodriguez and the obstacles she had overcome. He thought about the other female soldiers in his unit who had performed with distinction despite facing additional challenges. He thought about his father and the values he had tried to instill. Yes, ma'am. I'm ready. Lieutenant General Chen smiled for the first time since he had entered her office. I was hoping you'd say that. Your promotion ceremony is scheduled for next month. Until then, I want you to start thinking about how we can institutionalize the lessons you've learned over the past 6 months. As Mitchell prepared to leave, Lieutenant General Chen called him back. One more thing, Colonel. That night at the gala, I want you to know that I wasn't just teaching you a lesson. I was giving you a choice. You could have responded with resentment and resistance. Instead, you chose growth and improvement. That choice has made all the difference. Walking back to his office, Mitchell reflected on the journey of the past 6 months. It had been uncomfortable, challenging, and humbling. But it had also been transformative in ways he was still discovering. He thought about his upcoming promotion and the responsibilities it would bring. He thought about the programs he would help develop and implement. Most of all, he thought about the officers who would benefit from better leadership development and more equitable opportunities. His phone buzzed with a text message from Captain Rodriguez. Sir, just heard about your promotion. Congratulations. Thank you for believing in me and helping me become a better officer. Looking forward to working for you when I'm a general myself someday. Mitchell smiled as he typed his response. The Army will be lucky to have you in any position you choose to pursue. Never stop pushing boundaries and exceeding expectations. As he entered his office building, Mitchell noticed a young female lieutenant struggling with an armload of files. Without hesitation, he held the door for her and helped her gather the papers that had started to slip. Thank you, sir, she said, clearly surprised by the assistance from a senior officer. You're welcome, Lieutenant. Keep up the good work. It was a small gesture, the kind he might have ignored before. But Mitchell had learned that leadership was often demonstrated through small actions, daily choices, and the consistent treatment of all soldiers with respect and dignity. That evening, as he reviewed his notes for the next day's staff meeting, Mitchell found himself thinking about Lieutenant General Chen's words about lasting transformation. The changes in his own attitudes and behaviors had started reluctantly, born out of necessity rather than conviction. But, over time, they had become genuine, integrated into his fundamental understanding of leadership and command. He looked at the photograph of his father on his desk, a picture taken during his father's own promotion to general officer rank. For the first time since that night at Fort Braxton, Mitchell felt that he might be worthy of carrying on his father's legacy. The party had gone silent when the commander revealed who she really was. But, for Mitchell, that silence had been the beginning of a conversation with himself about what kind of leader he wanted to be. 6 months later, he finally had his answer.